All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another discussion
Hello.
of the Edan Trilogy. And I am so thrilled to be sitting here today with my three wonderful guests. And I will introduce each of them and allow them to say hello before we get started. Carina is a fellow booktuber and also a fellow author of fantasy, primarily writing in your native language, though, German, I think, right?
Yes.
And her channel is Carina Zacharias. I will have a link to it in the description below. And of course, Carina has been on my channel before for Dear Dr. Fantasy, and it is so lovely to see you again, Carina. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, I'm very excited to get your perspective on this as a European, as somebody who is familiar with a place there. I once lived, and I consider an inspiration for me. That is to say, Germany. So
Yeah.
I'm very eager to get your thoughts on the trilogy, and I also have here another fellow writer, and someone whose books I have enjoyed thoroughly. And Vaughn, do you look a little frozen there? Are you frozen? I think Vaughn is frozen. Oh no.
Yes.
So hopefully we'll get back to he'll come back. So we'll go to Matt.
Hmm.
And Matt, how are you doing? Matt is also a fellow booktuber. His channel is Go Read Books. Go spelled very cleverly. And that's, I think, a play on the Cajun influence in your life. Is that correct, Matt?
That is correct. I'm originally from Louisiana, and so there is a Cajun and French background there. Yeah, and it's good to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, I have too. I'm very, very grateful for you having read the books and being so supportive. I'm so glad that the books have spoken to you in the ways that they seem to have. So I'm eager to get your thoughts here today. And Vaughn will return, I am sure, when he's able to log back in. He is in a fairly, I think, rural area, so I don't know if it's an internet issue, but he's out in Michigan, in a fairly remote area. I don't know if that's where he is at the moment. He has a lovely cabin somewhere in the wilderness of Michigan. So
Nice.
yeah, but yeah, he'll be back. But I do want to say that Vaughn is a fellow author. He is the author of The Severing Sun, is the first book in the Sundered Nation trilogy. And the second book in that trilogy is going to be coming out very soon, Bold Ascension. And I'm very excited. In fact, I'm going to start reading it in a couple days because I have an advanced copy. So I'm very excited for that. And I enjoyed The Severing Sun immensely. It is one of my favorite self-published books. So yeah. So
I,
Matt, did you want to say something there?
I was just going to mention that I'm currently reading The Severing Sun. I'm about
Ah,
50 pages in and really enjoying it.
good, good, good. Yeah. So we'll have to tell Vaughn that when he comes back.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is fantastic. So, all right. Well, with all of that said, and again, my thanks to you guys for being here today. Let's get started. And the same format I'm going to use for all of these discussions, and every one of them has been different so far. I've been very delighted with the way these have panned out. But the basic format is no spoilers in the beginning, so people who have not read the series can listen in for a while. And then we'll be doing spoilers for The Way of Edan only. And then we'll be doing spoilers for book two, The Prophet of Edan. And then, because all three of you have read book three, we are going to be doing spoilers for Return to Edan. So there we are. And let us begin with the non-spoilers, though. And Carina, what would you like to ask or observe or say, non-spoiler wise, anything related to writing, because you are also a writer, or just whatever you like, non-spoiler.
Okay. Yeah, I thought maybe for a non-spoiler question, it would be safe to ask about the covers. I hope you can answer this in a way that is non-spoilery,
Oh
but
yeah.
I would love to hear more about the design process and how you decided on the design, and maybe also how you decided which characters would be portrayed on the books. So, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I have actually a video out with the cover designer, whose name is
Okay.
Jack Shepard. And it was just a delight to work with both Jack and with Kira Gregory, the artist, for the covers. Jack also did the map, by the way. And basically, for each cover, I had a particular scene. And I can't really explain why, except that I felt that each of the scenes, in some way or other, was could be kind of non-spoilery, but also in some way or other got to the heart of what that book was about. And I
Mm.
wanted, because your cover is an opportunity to tell your reader, here's what this book is about, right? And I feel the same way about the prologue, by the way. But the cover is the first opportunity, and people do judge a book by its cover. So
They do.
um, there, I feel not conventional fantasy covers with the whole stained glass window motif that I have going with them, and that was a something that I knew might be a disadvantage because a lot of times people want to look for epic fantasy. They expect a certain kind of, they expect somebody with a sword or, you know, a dragon and maybe a more realism in the art or something like that. But I decided that it would be worth it to go with the stained glass windows because maybe it helps it stand out a little bit different. I feel like these covers are very vibrant because that's
Yeah.
what stained glass windows are all about. They're all about color.
Yep.
And I felt like, okay, this it could help them stand out a little bit, maybe. So maybe it's worth the risk. And also, stained glass windows have a religious connotation to them. And a holy war is at the heart of this trilogy. That's not a spoiler. There's a holy war going on. So I felt like the religious vibe could be appropriate as well. So I
Yeah.
decided, okay, let's do stained glass windows. I decided that fairly early in the process, and I asked Kira could you please do a stained glass window based on this scene? And I gave Kira the particular scene. And yeah, Kira came up with the basic art, the colors, and what you see for the most part. But then Jack did a process, which you can, if you're curious enough, you want to watch that video.
Yeah.
It's actually quite a process. There are over 600 layers on,
Oh,
well, I know for a fact on Return to Edan. So that
wow.
make it, well, you can't see it very well in the video, but what Jack has done is he has made these look like stained glass. And if you look closely, there are little bumps and there's, you know, little irregularities, little splotches, and it makes it look like stained glass. That took that was a process where he had over 600 layers to make it look that way, taking the original art. So I was fascinated by that. I did not know that it was such an involved process that you can't just push a button and say stained glass effect, you know. So
Yeah.
so that was kind of cool. And I really enjoyed learning about that process. But yeah, each of the covers, I hope, you know, this is a lot of people ask about this one, and it's the elf. That's all I'll say. I don't think that's a spoiler. It's the elf, everyone. And there's a little hint on the back because there's a raven. And then this is, for me, a very important scene that's deep into the book, but I don't think it's too spoilery. It does tell people, hey, there's dragons in this one, and this is a much more action-oriented book, I feel. And then this one, I think, really, I hope, captures the tone of Return to Edan, which is, yeah. And I like the colors that Kira came up with that for art too. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Good. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So we'll go with Matt next. By the way, Vaughn, Matt is reading The Severing Sun right now.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So I assume I'm back.
You are back,
Yeah.
and yes, you are there. Thank goodness. But yeah, I sort of kind of introduced you, but if I also, while you're here, thank you so much for being here. And I told people about Bold Ascension coming out soon, et cetera, et cetera. So if you watch the replay, you'll be able to see what I said about you.
Okay. Yeah, I had to change venues. I was in my wife's office and something went fluey, so I'm in my office.
Don't you love technology? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I had to run. Oh.
We'll let you
I'm
catch
good.
your breath then, and we'll ask Matt to go next, and I'll ask you to go third for the non-spoiler question or observation or whatever. So Matt, what would you like to say about in a non-spoiler way?
Well, first of all, commenting on the last question. So when I read these books, in fact, I read all three of them. I thought this was Sequara. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to go ahead and ask you forgive me of pronouncing names, but Sequara, I thought that
Perfect.
was Sequara the entire time. I thought this was either Irid or even the Queen of Astaroth. I wasn't sure, so that's who I had in my mind that it was the entire time I read, and then I heard you say it was the elf. I'm like, well, that just changes everything in my mind. But anyway,
Yeah.
so as I was beginning to read, and of course, there's obvious religious everywhere. It's full of religious things. I was wondering, did you the Crusades, is that any inspiration in? Because it seemed like I'm not saying it was exactly, but you have a Roman Catholic. It seemed Roman Catholic, possibly, at least in some ways. I don't mean exactly. I just mean in some ways it seemed like it could be, and then coming out in a crusade type fashion. I was wondering if that was a an inspiration.
Yeah. So I would say it's probably a broader thing. I certainly don't mean the Way of Edan. That is one of 4 religions, by the way, that I portray in the series. And I don't at all intend for it to be a one-for-one correspondence to Roman Catholicism or any other religion. It is monotheistic. It is probably more liturgical, like you could say, more inclined toward ritual and that sort of thing, which probably makes some, priests wear robes, etc., which probably makes people think more of Roman Catholicism in the Western context than, say, many Protestant denominations, which tend to be more stripped down. They don't have the liturgy, they don't have the incense and the ritual and all that. So in that sense, I could see where it would be more reminiscent of Roman Catholicism, or even, Orthodox churches or that sort of thing, than, say, Protestantism. But it really isn't meant to be any particular religion. It's a fictional religion, completely
Absolutely.
fictional. And as far as the Crusades, that is one example in human history of many of human beings, some of them genuine believers, some of them very cynical, using a religion as a tool to grasp power and wealth. But it's one example of many of human beings using religion as an excuse to perpetrate violence on other people. It's been done and is still being done, unfortunately, in our world today. But it's been done many, many times. So you could say, the Crusades, or the Inquisition, or even, say, the Salem witch trials. I'm a New Englander, descendant of Puritans myself. So, but yeah, there are numerous examples, even outside of Christianity, of course, of religion being used as a bludgeon, as a religion, which I completely believe is a there are many examples of religion inspiring compassion and love and connection and understanding. But that said, I think we can all agree that history is full of examples of religion being used for violence and to justify hatred and greed. So in a broad sense, yes, the Crusades, you could say, is a one of many examples that I'm trying to explore, because I am fascinated by the question: how is it that we have something that is so capable of inspiring good in people, and at the same time has been used so many times to do evil? And that question fascinates me. That's human beings for you, right? We are such creatures that are we're so conflicted and so contradictory and so paradoxical in so many ways. And we are capable of compassion and connection, and we are capable of hate and destruction. And, having that all wrapped up in one creature is really amazing, so that's something I'm trying to explore And I do hope that people will see, especially as you continue reading the trilogy, that there are positive examples as well of religion in the trilogy.
Right.
Just saying, I'm definitely not saying religion bad in this trilogy. I'm actually trying to say religion is an expression of what we are.
And I definitely think that came out very well in the books. It kind of reminds me of in the book of James, in the letter of James, it talks about how can good things and bad things come from the mouth, come from the tongue. Well, also religion, you see very good things coming from religion, but you also see negative and bad things coming from it as well, because we're a fallen people.
Yep. That seems to be the way we are, you know. So yeah, unfortunately, yeah. And it oftentimes, as I said before, there are some people who are genuine, who believe that what they are doing is for the greater good or is for a higher good. And from my perspective or your perspective, they might be committing atrocities. But they feel justified in doing it because they believe they're obeying a higher good, a summons from above, if you will. And I believe I do not question that some people genuinely believe that. So yeah, that is something I try to explore in here. Others are very cynical, I think. There are plenty of people, politicians even today, who pretend to be religious because they think it gets the votes or justifies something else that they have in their agenda. So that's a thing too. So yeah, I'm trying to explore the interplay between that genuine belief versus exploitation of religion. And I think there are certain characters that you can say, yeah, this one is genuine and this one is an exploiter. So yeah, thank you for that question, because it's really central to what I'm doing here. I appreciate it. So Vaughn, now that you're back and rested and ready, non-spoiler thoughts.
Okay, I guess where I would go as a fellow writer is the evolution of your prose. I've seen the evolution of it, although I know you were like me and wrote the whole trilogy before releasing it. But the first book to the third book, there is an evolution, but it's pretty seamless. I mean, what I'm guessing and what I'll say and I'll ask you is, did you begin as I did, writing perhaps a bit more archaically and formally, and then kind of in your revision process back off of that a little bit? Or did you always have a kind of, because it's fairly loose. I mean, it's fairly modern, but with archaism sprinkled through it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But did you start out more formally or not? Because I sense a little more formality in the Way of Edan than I do. And by the time we get to Return, it feels, maybe it was just me growing accustomed to your prose, but I'm not sure.
That could be it too. I did not consciously change my prose as I was writing, but I'm sure that it does change in some way or other, and that's inevitable. I think that I think every writer has a certain style that is pretty identifiable. Certain words that we like, you know. I've been accused of using certain words over and over again, like curdle or Bernie, or or what have you. Every author has their words, and I think that you and I both share this. All of us are Tolkien fans, I think, here,
Right.
and Tolkien is just in my bloodstream, you know. So, and I'm a medievalist.
Right.
That's my, outside of fantasy, the greatest inspirations for my writing are definitely texts like Beowulf and the sagas and the Kalevala, stuff like that. I don't read Finnish, but I've read the Kalevala in translation many times. So yeah, there are definite medieval inspirations there. And so I'm attracted to archaic language as a medievalist. And I think there are certain modern fantasy writers that do it really well. George R.R. Martin comes to mind as a writer who's, I think, very accessible in his prose, but effectively sprinkles in some archaic language here and there, specific words, sometimes just the semantics, reversing the order of something, giving a slightly more archaic feel. And that's what I was going for. I wanted to write something that is accessible, but makes you feel like you're in another world and another time, that is immersive for the reader. That's my goal with the prose. I'm very much, and I've said it a gazillion times on YouTube, but I'm an admirer of Ursula Le Guin's essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, where she talks about fantasy prose and how important it can be to establish for the reader, this is not our world. This is not New Jersey, right? So you don't want your characters saying, hey, bro, what's up? Because boom, you just kicked your reader out of the world, So that's an important consideration for me with the prose. So I try to make it throughout enough archaic to allow the reader to feel they're in another world, but I didn't want to make it inaccessible for a lot of readers, because not everybody is a medievalist, and not everybody, wants to work really hard to figure out what you're saying in a sentence. So hopefully I struck that balance. I'm sure that it changed, it evolved a little bit as I wrote. I do think that the Beowulf influence is probably strongest in the Way of Edan. So that might be something you're picking up as well.
Yeah.
And by the time I'm on return to Edan, I'm kind of doing my own thing. I'm doing something. I think the book where I do take the most risks, I do my own thing, or probably I'm just letting everything out, is Return to Edan. So yeah.
I would say in regard to the Tolkien aspects, which I see a lot of fellow reviewers and mentions on Twitter and so forth about the Tolkienism or Tolkien-esque aspect. And I would say it's in regard to kind of the atmosphere of the storytelling rather than anything specific about the story or about your prose even. It's just got kind of, like you do have, and all the way through, kind of a fellowship aspect of it. And that fellowship, I mean, they're just so altruistic throughout, and that's such a positive, even though a lot of dark things happen throughout the story and some very, very grim things, that lightness is always present. And I think that's, for me, that's what I picked up on that felt like Tolkien to me. So just as a comment.
I'm very glad you feel that way, because that's very important to me. As much as the story can get very grim at times, I am trying to convey a sense of beauty and hope and wonder ultimately, and hopefully that is at least a thread that continues throughout. So I'm glad that you feel that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good.
If I may just piggyback off something he said, I heard a lot of people talk about how this book or these books reminded them of Tolkien in ways, and there were jokes made about you being like Tolkien. As I read through this, I don't think there was anything that you just took directly from it, not copying in any way. But I did something I noticed and that reminded me of my reads through Tolkien's writing is that your descriptions of things. You spent a lot of time describing nature. You spent a lot of time describing the atmosphere of things going on around of trees or hills or something like that. Yeah. And that really brought me back to my reading of how Tolkien spent a lot of time on those things. So I felt like it was in the way you described things is what reminded me.
Yeah, that is how I believe, and it makes me a little sad when people dismiss prose as not an important part of the story. The prose is the story. And it is through those descriptions that I hope I'm able to convey a sense of beauty, because that is one of the things I love most about Tolkien's writing. It is that pervasive sense of beauty and sorrow simultaneously that elevates his writing to me. and makes it so wondrous and so transformative, and
I'll
helps
give
you.
an example. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I'll give an example of something from the Way of Edan. There was a scene. I don't think this is spoiling anything, but there was a scene where Sequoia is returning to Astrolabe, and it's her perspective, and then all of a sudden it's through the perspective of a bird,
Yes.
describing flying over the ocean, over to the on the beach, and describing what it's seeing from a bird's eye view. And I enjoyed there. There's not a lot I could say I didn't enjoy about the writing, but there every once in a while there's things like that come up that just blew me away with like the description of the land through the eyes of the bird. I just love that.
I'm so glad you love that. I had at least one reviewer who expressed quite a bit of distaste for that. So, but I'm so glad that you loved it, because I enjoyed writing that, and I felt like, and maybe that's not for every reader. Maybe some readers just want, more action, 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 and they don't want description, and that's okay. I have no issue with their tastes. But for me, bathing the reader, who is engaging with the story in a sense of beauty, was important to me, and the setting and the world building and all of that, those are important aspects of the storytelling for me. And so people who appreciate that, I love to hear it. And it's not going to be for everyone, but that particular scene, I had a lot of fun, and I wanted to convey to the reader, this is a beautiful place. This island is a beautiful place, full of wonder, full of magic, full of nature. And that, I felt, was a quick way to do that, to have that bird, giving you the bird's eye view, literally in this case, of Astrolabe. So I wanted the reader to kind of fall in love with that place, and having a sense of attachment to it. And that was, I guess, one strategy I tried to use. So yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think we are ready then for spoilers for The Way of Edan. So if you have not read it yet, this is your cue. Spoilers for The Way of Edan. And we are going to start with Carina. And what would you like to say or ask about The Way of Edan?
Yeah, as you know, I made a review video about the book, and I pretty much praised it from beginning to end because I liked it so much. But there was one thing I said that was maybe a little critical, and it was about the very beginning of the book, like the prologue and the first scene of the first chapter. I think I said something like, it was very shocking for me, because, at first we meet this, I think it's a young priest, and I knew nothing about the story going into it. So I was like, oh, maybe he's my protagonist. And, and then surprise, he dies like a very violent death. And then I'm like, okay, well, that was the prologue, of course. Something like that was bound to happen. But now I'm in the first chapter, and there's this young boy, and I quite like him. So maybe he's my protagonist now. And then, surprise, no, he dies as well. So I think I said something like, it was a bit much all at once, all this violence. And only after these scenes, I felt like the book really got into its rhythm and really sucked me in. And of course, I ended up falling in love with it. But yeah, I guess my question is, would you like to defend the beginning of the book? And was I maybe a little bit unfair in my assessment? And yeah, I'm sure you had very good reasons for writing it in this way.
Yeah. No, you were not unfair at all. That's a legitimate response, I think. But I'll tell you what I was trying to do, in including. And by the way, the book originally started on chapter 3. So everything before chapter 3 was added later.
Interesting.
Particularly chapter 2, where I introduced Sequoia. That chapter I introduced much later, even after I think I had written the 3rd book. But yeah, so I added that prologue and the part of chapter 1 where Oswy is meets his very grim end. And I had alluded to that in what's now chapter 3, I said this was the instigating event, that they were avenging a boy who had been killed by these pukas, these woodland creatures. I won't call them monsters because they're not the real monsters in the story. But I wanted to, my intention at least, was to signal to the reader, and this is a prologue again, is an opportunity to do that. So your prologue is an opportunity to tell your reader about some important theme, about the tone of the book, something important. And my intention all along was to be very honest about violence, because the backdrop for this whole thing is a holy war. That's going to involve some violence, some terrible things. And that is, of course, the nature of war. And I'm trying to be as honest as I can. I have not been in war. I've not been in combat or anything like that. So I am using my imagination. I am using stories that I've read by people who have been in combat and in war, who've described it. But trying as best I can to be honest. I did not want to glorify violence in any way whatsoever. And I wanted to show it in a pretty visceral way. I wanted to show it as it must feel to go through it as best as I could. That was important to me because I want to show that there are repercussions when you have an entity like Torland that is using a religion in order to expand itself, in order to assert power over other people through violent means. That affects individual lives and even has ripples in places you couldn't even have anticipated. So I am linking very deliberately the deaths of these 3 priests who martyr themselves, believing that what they're doing is an act of love. And yes, they end in a very violent way, but that is their intention, in fact. I wanted to link their deaths with the death of Oswy, who's far away from them, geographically. Mm-hmm. They're down in Cargillion. He's way up in the Mark. If you look at the map, they're very far apart from each other. And yet there is a very important connection. You do have a priest show up in the part where Oswy's body is discovered. There's a priest and a couple Torlander soldiers. So the white robe is a signal that these things are connected. Yeah. That boy dies because of the gearing up for war that Torland is doing. They're capturing these creatures in order to exploit them in war. And there are repercussions to that, as there always is in war. Collateral damage, they call it these days. But yes, lots of people die. Many of them are not the intended targets in war. And that is the nature of war. That is the nature of violence. And the repercussions spread and spread and spread. So I wanted to be as brutally honest as I could with that. And that is the reason why I start out that way. And I totally understand somebody would be like, ugh, I don't want to read this. This is awful. But I felt that it was important not to glamorize or idealize. I wanted it to be shocking. I wanted it to hurt. I wanted you to feel like, yes, Oswy, I like you. And then have him die before your very eyes. And I wanted it to be shocking. So
yeah, you succeeded. No, but I also I appreciate that explanation, and I also appreciate that throughout the whole series there are violent scenes, and you don't flinch away from showing the violence. And I think later on it didn't feel as grating, maybe because I was already invested in the story and I knew it wasn't all about violence in these books. But yeah. Also, how we experience a book is so different for each and every one of us. So I'm sure 99% of your readers were completely fine with it.
No, yeah. I think that you represent a good portion of the people who read the books. Not everyone loves to read about battles. And believe it or not, I actually edited out some battle scenes.
Okay.
Just because I figured, you know what, there's enough of this. I feel like it's kind of boring to keep going over, you can only have so many, so much blood splashing and that sort of thing. So, and in fact, I think really what's more interesting would be the reasons for the violence and the consequences of the violence. And I hope that I do enough with those things, because
Definitely.
they're actually more important in many respects than the violence itself. Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Great question.
thanks.
Wonderful question, actually. So Matt, what would you like to talk about in terms of the Way of Edan?
Well, chapter 14, the eternal worship. And of course, I am drawn to these scenes, especially when you see how the way works, how the religion works. And there is this in the first section of chapter 14, the eternal worship, there is this scene, this worship service.
Good.
Very liturgical seems. And I understand what you mean, that this isn't just one it's not an example of one religion. This is a fantasy religion. I understand that, but I was wondering what other influences would go into bringing this worship service together, and even the process of you writing this. What was your inspirations? What was your thoughts as you were building this elaborate worship service, and really in some ways beautiful, in some ways frightening as well? But so anyway, it really, this is a particular chapter that really stood out to me among all three of the books.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about it. This was a chapter where I did two things, and much of it centers on Bledla, because he is the officiant. He is the one conducting this service, if you will. It is not in his mind, at least not. Well, I'll put it this way: in Bledla's mind, this is an opportunity to show the power of Edan. And he believes that he is himself a vessel to implement the will of Edan. And he doesn't, to his credit, even though he is a fanatic, even though he is responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths, which is not something I'm a fan of, but to his credit, it's not about him. It's never about his ego so much as he is a true believer. He wants the will of Edan to be fulfilled. He wants to bring about the kingdom of the eternal. And he sees himself as a vessel in that process. And he's constantly fighting his own ego in that sense. Very important to me was actually what happens after the ritual. I feel like that's even more interesting than the ritual itself, where it's a bit of a show-off thing. He does the few spells that really create a sense of awe and wonder. And for Bledla, in his mind, the main reason is people need to feel this for Edan, not me. It's about Edan, So he checks himself afterwards. He literally flagellates himself. In that scene where he's trying to keep his ego in check. It's not about me. It's about Edan. I feel
which was a great character moment for Bledna.
Yeah, I hope so.
In learning more about him.
Yeah. That was the beginning of me trying to make this character, who might come across as simply a very, just evil villain guy, without any nuance. I'm trying to add nuance to Bledla as I go on in book one. This scene, and then there's a later scene where Bledla actually meets Dayraven. And he has this doubt. What if I'm not the one who's supposed to do this? What if this kid here, and it just rocks his world. It creates this crisis in him, because it occurs to him that what if Edan's will is going to happen through him and not me? And that just completely shifts his entire worldview in that moment, which is, like an earthquake for him, So I'm trying to introduce some nuance into this character. And the ritual itself, as far as, you're right. It's very liturgical. It's, intone and respond. And there's a point where everybody has this chant going on, and he's doing his song of origin in the middle of it, and all these big things are happening. And so of course, again, fantasy religion, there aren't too many religions where, the priest can make it rain and have flames, light up the place and have winds and all that. So I don't think I consciously said, let me make this like this or that. I just thought,
Right.
what would be a convincing service here? What would be a convincing ritual? And that would convey what this religion is all about, you know?
Right.
So there is an important sense of oneness in here. And I could see where people would see the sharing of the blood during the ceremony as an echo in a way of communion. I could see where people
Right.
would say
Right.
that, right? But yeah, it's not meant to necessarily be. And I agree, this is the tradition I grew up in too. I did grow up more or less mainstream Protestant, I guess you could say, but I did attend a more liturgical Protestant church at one point in my life too, an Episcopal church, where they do practice more liturgy, and it more resembles Catholicism than other Protestant churches do. So yeah, I think that could have come through without me even really giving it much thought, you know.
Well, something I really appreciated, and of course, I know we all come to these books and any book we read with our own perspectives and our own experience as we read it. And as a pastor, someone who leads services, I can't help but these things really jump out to me. But
of course. Yeah.
Something that I was going to say, something I appreciate is, obviously you're not the first one to write religion into fantasies. It's been going on for a long, long time. But I will say I've never seen the religion as played out, their worship service, how they do certain things, as put out as clearly as I saw it in this particular trilogy. And I really appreciated that, getting more of we talked about the bird's eye view, a worm's eye view of the religion in this book.
Yeah. I guess that was, I didn't think that through a ton as I was writing. It just came out. And so that's probably a product of who I am, and what I'm wrestling with. It just was a natural, instinctual thing for me to do. So maybe that's something I'm bringing to, and not everybody's going to like that, not everybody wants to read about religion and fantasy, but it was central for me, and what I was trying to do, what I was trying to accomplish here. So yeah, I'm glad that I don't know if you would like to, make fire shoot up and make an earthquake happen while you're doing one of your sermons, but it could be kind of cool, Matt. Yeah.
Well, you could go to the Old Testament and see a little bit of that. But anyway, no, I obviously it's a fantasy religion, but it's still really interesting to see how things connect with my own personal experience.
Yeah.
Because there is somewhat of a shared experience, I would say, between us. Not exactly, but similar. Yeah. And so it just really stood out to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Very cool. Yeah. Thank you. So Vaughn, what would you like to talk about in terms of the Way of Edan?
Okay, let's talk about the elf.
All right.
That is a very unique take on elves. Tell us a little bit about how it evolved and how, we really only meet the elf and the evolution of it. By the time I got to the end, I'm like, oh, I had a kind of a new understanding, but it's just so unique. How did it evolve and where did it come from?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to apologize to Tolkien here, because I have a very different take on elves.
Yes,
Tolkien's, and I'm not sure he would have been extremely happy about where it comes from, but it comes from Old English, partly at least. In Old English poetry, elves are terrifying. They're, yes, probably beautiful, we know, because there are lots of names like Alsheen, which means, elf beauty or something of that nature. So there are lots of elf names, and you wouldn't have those names if there weren't something positive, at least, about elves. But they're also spoken of with a great deal of dread, with a great deal of there's a list in Beowulf of monsters, and one of the ones named is elves. They're right alongside the giants and orkneas, and which we don't really know what those are. Maybe they're corpse eaters or something like that. But the word orc is there, right next to the word elf in this list of monsters. And Tolkien, in his translation, this is something I was talking about recently with Tom Shippey, actually. Tom Shippey being one of the, if not the greatest Tolkien scholar there is, but also a medievalist. I was talking to Tom Shippey about his translation of Beowulf. And we were talking about how Tolkien actually fudged his own translation. He called the elves, clearly it's Ilva in Old English, clearly means elves. But Tolkien made it into something else, like goblins or something like that. He just kind of erased the elves from that list. Because for Tolkien, elves are beautiful. You know, they should not be listed among all these monsters, you know. So Tolkien corrected the Beowulf poet in that moment by excluding elves from that list, which is tells you something about what Tolkien wanted to convey with elves. He felt that there was something else, and he so beautifully portrayed them. Of course, we all love Tolkien's elves. I'm sure I know I do, but with the sense of beauty and melancholy that he brings to his stories through the elves, and the layers and layers of history. But yeah, so essentially I'm doing something that Tolkien might not have appreciated in my portrayal of the elf, in making it something much more primal, much more terrifying. So that was one thing I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to that. And the other thing I think that you can definitely say about the elf, as it relates to the magic in this world, is that there's definitely a very Eastern or Buddhist philosophical underpinning in terms of what this is, in terms of the elf stripping away your individual ego and the revelation that you, in fact, this narrative of you, this idea of you as a person, is an illusion, essentially, that you are actually part of something much bigger than you are, something vast and almost eternal, and a kind of energy that pervades the universe. It's like this analogy that I read about, and I've talked about several times in a book about Buddhism by Thich Nhat Hanh, where it's called The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching. And he talks about the individual as a wave on the ocean. And the wave is differentiated from the rest of the ocean because, it pokes up a little bit there and it thinks of itself as a nice little happy wave. But really, that wave is part of all that water underneath it. And it's not really a separate thing, is it? And that's the revelation that the elf, probably for most people, it's not exactly a welcome revelation. The idea that I am not just fleeting, that I am not just this tiny little mote of dust, but that the whole idea of me as a separate entity is an illusion, that I'm really part of everything, and part of this divine energy, let's say, that pervades the universe. So that's scary for a lot of people to hear, because I walk around thinking I'm very important. I'm the center of my story. I'm the hero here, right? The elf says, no, actually, you're a little mote of dust, and that's not a very comforting message to hear, I think.
But having said that, the elf does sort of make Dayraven, your protagonist, special, because Dayraven's able to endure what everybody presumed as soon as he had encountered an elf, he was gone, he was done for. That was been. Yeah. So you've in essence elevated him to something a little bit different right off the bat through that exposure. So.
And well, I have no idea. I actually don't know why Dayraven survived when no one else ever had. I cannot explain that to you. I have my theories, and maybe you guys too have your theories, but that's one of the mysteries of the story, I think. Why does Dayraven...
It's a mystery that's right at the core of the whole story, though, that it kind of compels you forward. And you gain understanding about the elf. It takes all 3 books to get, and I'm sure I could keep going and learn more. But yeah, it's quite a journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do think that you learn more about the magic and the elf with each book, with being without spoilers, especially in the 3rd book.
Yeah.
And the struggle that begins in the 1st book between Dayraven and the elf becomes central by the 3rd book. And if it isn't already central in the 1st, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger with each book. And yeah, so yeah, and that struggle is at the heart of what I'm trying to explore here, because I think even as the elf asserts, you're an insignificant mote of dust, and in fact, maybe humans are kind of a cancer on this planet, and maybe the life would be better without humans. Dayravens keeps insisting that no, actually, humans are capable of compassion. Humans are capable of love. Humans are capable of beauty and wonder, and their lives are worth it. And maybe that's the heart of his heroism,
Right. I would agree.
Yeah. So, all right, well, let's move on to the Prophet of Edan, book 2. I always like to show off the dragon there. So, Carina, what would you like to say about book 2, the Prophet of Edan?
Yeah, funnily enough, I also wanted to ask about elves, actually.
Aha, okay.
Because I also found them quite fascinating. And now I'm thinking maybe instead I can ask about the dwarves. Am I pronouncing
that? Oh, the dwarves, yes.
Dwarves?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I think they are also a special spin on dwarves, your special spin on them. So maybe you want to talk about that inspiration.
Sure, yes. So one of the more important characters for me is Gnorn, whose name I took from Old English, and it means sorrow, because of the particular history of the dwergs, who are the oldest inhabitants of Jormunland. They have another name for this continent that they don't reveal to outsiders, but they have their own language. They have their own culture, or I should say cultures, because of old, before these other human species invaded or migrated, as it might be, to this continent, there were dwergs. There were also dragons, and the dwergs and the dragons were fighting each other. But the dwergs were also fighting amongst themselves, and there were separate enclaves of them. And they have a whole history that is full of atrocities and what have you. So the dwergs of this world, they're very tribal in that sense, that the dwergs of the Fernhaus don't necessarily like or get along with or even want to have anything to do with the dwergs of the Dwergklaes, or one of the other places where there are a few pockets of dwergs remaining in this world. The dwergs that we see in the story are unique in the sense that they have been ousted from their homeland by the Theos. And so they are people without a home, and they have dwindled down to just a few hundred survivors. So it's been a few hundred years, a couple hundred years since their people were exiled. And they found a home of a sort in Torland, although basically they're not viewed. They have all kinds of negative stereotypes about them, and they are exploited for their expertise. They are great. As this is a classic, dwarf thing to have them be great blacksmiths or weaponsmiths or goldsmiths or what have you. So I think I lean on a few pretty classical tropes about dwarves. As that's a word that comes from Old Norse, by the way. Dwerg is a word that I'm taking more directly from Old English. So people are wondering, why does he call them dwergs and not dwarves? Well, I'm going back to the true tradition, folks. I'm going to Old English. Nothing wrong with dwarves, but I thought it would be nice to add a little spin there. So I tried to give Gnorn and Hlok and the others their own particular history there. And it is a history of exile. It is a history with many sorrowful moments in it. And that was important to me because right away, one of the things I'm exploring is the relationship between your identity and your culture. And exile is a very poignant way to explore that. So Dayraven is in exile, and he hits it off right away with Gnorn and Hwalk because they are fellow exiles of the sort. And they're able to have a kind of connection through that. So that's what I'm doing with the dwergs, is exploring identity and the relationship between that and culture and place, and because they never stop longing for their homeland. It's a dream for them to return someday. And I try to explore that a lot through the relationship that forms definitely by the Prophet of Edan between Gnorn and Orvandil.
Yes.
Orvandil being a member of the race of people who displaced the dwergs of the Fern House. So that might be a bit of a Tolkien nod too. I think that Orvandil is quite different from Legolas, but there is a kind of a friendship that forms between Gimli and Legolas that has some parallels, I think, with Orvandil and Gnorn in my trilogy. So
I was reminded of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I was doing with the dwergs.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, Gnorn was a favorite character of mine, and I always imagined maybe that he's the one that writes down this story, because he is a lore master, right? So if I even considered doing it would have been too much like Tolkien, really, but I even considered doing a thing where I was posing as a mere translator, and I was translating a book that was written by Gnorn about Dayraven, and that's what this is, that would have been a kind of fun thing to do, but yeah, I relate to Gnorn in many ways.
Yeah, me too. I think he and Orvandil are probably among my favorite characters from the books.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. So thank you. So Matt, what would you like to talk about in terms of the Prophet of Edan?
A couple of things. One, I think you could answer it well, however you wanted to, but I mean, one I don't think would take long. The other, it might require a little more discussion. But one, the shorter one would be the people of the tribes.
Yes.
I really didn't have anything to connect it back to of what type of people or who they might be like. So kind of what my mind did was bring it back to the Dothraki. That's kind of
interesting. Okay.
Well, so my mind, that's how my mind viewed these people, and that may be absolutely not the way you had it pictured. Probably wasn't, but I was curious. What was your inspiration for the people of the tribes? If there was, maybe you just made it up, which is fine, but or you may have had an inspiration for that. So that's one question I had.
Okay. We'll tackle that first. I have a feeling that Carina would probably know something about this based on the language that they speak, which is not German, by the way, but it is my kind of version of a sort of Proto-Germanic. And I think that anybody who speaks German would be able to probably follow a lot of a conversation in the language of the folk of the tribes. I was told by one, or I read something that one reader wrote that said, it sounds like German being spoken by a drunken Norwegian. So I thought that was pretty funny, but it's actually much more archaic. But there are elements of Old English in it, elements of Old Norse, and elements of what I imagine to be maybe some Old High German. But it's supposed to be kind of a Proto-Germanic. And the folk of the tribes, as they call themselves, the Ilarchai, as outsiders call them.
Yeah.
They are meant to be very similar to the types of people that were described by Tacitus in his history of the Germanic peoples, going way back to, I think it was in the 1st century or close to it, 1st or 2nd century. Vaughn would be familiar with that too, I think. Yeah. So Tacitus being a Roman historian who wrote about the Germanic tribes that the Roman Empire was encountering. So I'm leaning on that a bit as well, as far as what I'm trying to imagine there. And they are also, importantly, the ancestral people of the people who became the folk of the Mark and Torland and Elend. Elend being the first of those kingdoms, and then Torland growing out of it, and then the Mark growing out of Torland. So these people they don't realize that they're actually cousins to the Ilarkhan.
Right.
They think they're civilized, and those barbarians over there have nothing to do with us. And that's something that is a revelation for Dayraven, even in the first book. And something that I get
We're
to.
More,
go ahead.
More connected than they realize.
Much more so, yeah. And that's true of humans too, by the way. In our world, we are much more connected than we think. We are much more mixed than we think. We tend to think of our nations as having, a certain type of people or a certain race or what have you. And a lot of that is just fiction. A lot of that is very simplified narrative, which leaves out a lot of the nuance and a lot of the complexity. And that's true of everywhere in the world. So yeah, I was trying to get that across. Again, exploring identity and culture and those sorts of things. But yeah, as far as the inspiration, you can probably read Tacitus and see a few things that I was, stealing from there. Yeah.
Well, that was very enjoyable reading about the folk of the tribes.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm glad.
The second thing I wanted to talk about, and this really spans all three books, but a lot in book 2, the magic, I don't know if you call it magic system. I'm not sure that my mind ever got a great grasp of what was happening. So as I'm reading, I see Dayraven using the magic, or anyone using the magic, and then it almost seems like they're coming out of themselves in some way and going into what is it called? The realm of origins. What was it called?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not entirely certain what was happening there. And that may have to do, you talk about the dualism as far as maybe a Buddhist influences that I'm not familiar with. I don't know. I was kind of contributing it to that possibly I may not be connecting with it well because of that. So my request is help me understand a little better the magic system.
Mm-hmm. So
what's going on.
Let's say you have the gift and you want to do a spell, sing a song of origin. You first have to put yourself in what I call, as you said, the realm of origins. You have to leave the realm of forms, which is the world as we experience it, with time. And
so is that their soul leaving their body, or a spirit of some type leaving their body?
I think you could say that. Yeah, why not? You could say that. In essence, they connect to a timeless realm, a realm that you could call it, some people call it creation time. But it's simply, if you could, because we're stuck within the limited dimensions that we experience. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around the idea of timelessness, of being in a fourth dimension outside of time and seeing everything as an eternal present. So this would be a more, it would be very difficult for a human being to really, really wrap their head around that, I think. But we can talk about it at least. Mm-hmm. And we can theorize, scientists can theorize, or even theologians can theorize that, that this sort of thing could exist. But it's hard for us to understand anyway. But anyway, yeah, that's what you're accessing when you allow yourself to, you allow your spirit, your essence, your energy to drift into that mode of perception, into that realm of origins. You're simply, in a way, you're stepping outside of time. And you're able to see from that more ethereal perspective. And from that point, you have a almost truer understanding of the life around you. And you're able to see into the essence of something. So for example, you're trying to sing a song of origin because you want to control a sparrow. Okay. And you want to have the sparrow do something, send a message to someone. So from the realm of origins, you are perceiving the sparrow as it really is. as opposed to how you would see it in the normal everyday world. As you are seeing your connection to it as well, and you are using your connection to it because it comes from the same divine energy that you come from, right? You are experiencing your connection with that creature in a way that you don't experience when you're living inside your skin and you're experiencing the world the way you normally do. And so accessing that connection, you're able to influence that creature. But the key thing here is you have to keep in touch with your own body. You have to keep in touch with your own separate ego at the same time, because you don't want to get lost. You don't want to put your energy into that sparrow and have it stay there forever, and then your body becomes an empty husk. So there's a risk. Yep. There's a risk to this as well. Yeah.
Which sort of reminded me of the magic of the Wheel of Time, that you don't want to use too much or go too far because whatever negative thing would happen.
Right.
So it reminded me of that.
There need to be repercussions to magic, I think. The magic system that I feel like it resembles the most is undoubtedly Robin Hobb's The Wit, which you will find in the Realm of the Elderlings. And the funny thing is, I had not read the Realm of the Elderlings when I wrote these.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. I never made that connection. I've read the first 5 books of the Realm of the Elderlings, and I've never made that connection until now. I can see that. Not that, like you said, you wrote it before, but I can see that similarity.
Yeah, yeah. So Robin Hobb stole my idea before I even had it. So, but yeah. So does that help, Matt?
It does help. It does help, and sort of it confirmed what I was already thinking, but wasn't sure if I was thinking in the right way. But yes, sir, it absolutely helped.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. Yeah, awesome. So, Vaughn, I think it's your turn. We're on the Prophet of Edan still.
Prophet of Edan, I guess I would have to say I love how everybody goes out into the world on their own, and the world expands so much. And I would say pace-wise, it's the most action intense of the 3. But what I noticed, and what I wanted to ask you about, is there, and not that I sense you trying to do any sort of one-to-one on the hero's journey, but I sense this sort of Campbellian aspect to Dayrhaven's going off on his own and having to confront himself. Was that part of your mindset, a little bit of the hero's journey for Dayrhaven in this book?
So I read Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces when I was in college. And it was a revelation to me. I loved, and I devoured everything I could get my hands on by Campbell after that, including that wonderful series of discussions he did with Bill Moyers. I don't know.
Oh, those were great. Yeah,
those were so wonderful. And if younger people might not have know what we're talking about, but Joseph
they're
Campbell,
still available. I think they're on YouTube, actually.
Oh, I bet they are. Yeah. So Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth is what they're called. And he did this series of discussions with the journalist Bill Moyers. And Joseph Campbell, if you're not aware, he's passed away, but he was a comparative mythologist, essentially. He talked about mythology, and he came up with this hero's journey type thing where, and a lot of scholars and academics have negative things to say about this because they accuse him of being very reductive and that sort of thing. And I'm very aware of all of that. But that said, he still had a tremendous impact on me and my love for myth. He really spoke to me when I was that age and broadened the world in such beautiful ways and really drove my desire to read mythology from all over the world. And he makes these connections, and he shows us a kind of hero's journey, a pattern, if you will, that a hero's life takes in various mythological traditions around the world. And so, it's something that's worth looking into, I think, and also looking into the criticism of it at the same time. I'll say that much about it. But yes, so the answer is yes, Vaughn. I think there probably is some influence there. I always thought of the three books as departure, transcendence, and return. And
right.
with the third book literally being called Return to Edan.
Right.
And I mean that in several different ways. I think you can understand, having read it, some of or all of those ways. But yeah, so that's the hero's journey pattern in its most simple terms is departure, leaving the womb, leaving the familiar place, having to say goodbye to that not only the familiar, but who you thought you were, your identity, leaving all that behind in order to, in the second part, transcend and to become more than what you are. And this, you could say, is a process that we all go through in maturing and becoming adults, you know. And so these old stories had a very important purpose in helping us to get our minds ready for these stages of our lives. And you know, a lot of rituals are centered around that as well. So yeah, as far as book one being the departure, I think you can see where Dayraven leaves behind the familiar. It leaves the womb-like, the Shire-like comfortable space, and has to go out and has to figure out from there, okay, what am I? Who am I now? You know, what am I going to do? And book two, Prophet of Edan, which we're talking about now, is the transcendence, where he has to become more than that ego that he thought he was. He has to shed that in order to accomplish the very important thing that he needs to accomplish. In this case, defeat Bledla and prevent Torlin from taking over the continent and killing thousands of more people. But he has to change himself. He has to leave himself behind to accomplish that. And there's a big sacrifice involved in that. And then return, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that is not something you see typically done very much in fantasy these days. I think it is the part of the hero's journey that is most neglected in modern storytelling. And I wanted to do something. I wanted to say, okay, so the hero saved the day and gave everything in the process. What now? You know, what now? What about all the scars? What about all the violence? What are the repercussions? We have a world that has been deeply traumatized by the conflict that has just ended. You don't go back to normal afterwards and dust off your hands and say, well, glad we're home now. Right. There are serious repercussions to deal with. And I decided, what the heck, I'm going to try that. So return in so many ways is what I'm trying to do. Return. And of course, you're not the same person you were when you go back, are you? You know, anyone who's ever gone off to college and then goes back to where they grew up can testify to the fact that there's this surreal sense in which, yeah, I'm not the same person, you know, anymore. I've moved on. You still love the place you came from. You still have a deep, abiding affection, but there's this weird feeling of, oh, yeah, I'm not the same anymore. So yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Good.
I sensed it, but I appreciate hearing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I was up to anyway. So now I did say Return to Edan. I think that's a perfect segue. So
right.
Carina, what did you think of Return to Edan?
It's probably my favorite from the whole trilogy, actually.
Mine too.
Cool.
So I like hearing that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very special book because at the end of book two, I thought, wow, this is something I had expected for the end of book three, the big battle and everything. So then I was completely lost. I thought, what is happening in this book? And yeah, it was very beautiful. And yeah, I guess the question I came up with for book three goes back to something Matt also said at the beginning of the discussion, that religion in itself, I would say, is something very good. Like it teaches good morals. Christianity teaches you to have compassion and to love thy neighbor and all that.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think other religions do similar things, but then again, it can inspire such dreadful acts and conflicts and war. And in Return to Eden, you almost present like a solution in Raven, who becomes a prophet, and through his speeches and his magic, he can help solve conflicts, because he can show the people who they really are and what harm they have done to other people, and they come to this revelation. Yeah, and I guess I was just thinking how much of this is fantasy, and could something like that happen in our reality? Like, can we solve such conflicts? Do we need a prophet for that? Just, yeah, I thought you probably have some interesting thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yes. One thing I like about Dayraven is that he never wanted to be a prophet. In fact, it's at near the end of book 2 when he has ended the battle and taken the dragons away from Bledla, who meets you could say early demise, because he's supposed to be the main baddie and he dies in book 2. Wait, what gives? But it's at that moment that Galdor says to Dayraven, okay, you're the prophet now, and he's like, I am? Oh, okay. And he tries his best to use that. That's, of course, by the way, after Sequara brings him back from essentially almost annihilating everybody. So that very, I hope, very human moment when Sequara,
yes,
through their love, but also she has his memories literally in her mind, and is able to give them back to him in that moment, and bring him from the brink of essentially alleviating everyone of their suffering. But yeah, his prophet status is not something he ever sought or wanted. It is just suddenly put on him. And he's like, okay, well, I will try to make the best of this. And after he loses his memory at the end of book 2, and we re-encounter him in book 3, he gradually, of course, he hears about this whole prophet, of Edan, that everyone assumes he must be. So he's like, okay, I don't know who I actually am. He doesn't know anything about himself. That's all he knows. So out of his own heart, he just tries to do what he feels is right with this power that is not very welcome, that keeps insisting that he do something that he doesn't want to do, which is kill everybody, which is take away all their suffering by dissipating their souls, if you will. So he tries his best to use this power. He's a very human character. That's one thing I wanted to be very clear about, is that he's not in any way, shape, or form divine. He is a human being struggling to do his best and ultimately failing to contain and use this power. Several things he does that actually don't go the way he wanted. One is he tries to reform Erkenwald. And there's that moment in Return to Edan where he pours all the memories of the people that Erkenwald has hurt into Erkenwald's mind, and that is shattering. And I don't think you can force someone to be empathetic. Dayraven ultimately fails because he has to pass along this power to Yoramon. Now you can't really blame him. He's about to blow up. It's about to erupt from him anyway. And out of desperation, he agrees. I think the better part of him probably knew that Yoramon would not be able to handle it, but he was hoping that Yoramon would be able to bear this burden that he had been carrying for so long. And of course, Yoramon was not able to for very long at all. Just he had a tiny moment there. Unfortunately interrupted by Morcar and Edulf, whose heads explode. in consequence, and Yoramon is very quickly brought back to his very selfish, angry nature, probably because those two remind him of what he is, which is essentially a very self-centered human being. So so Dayraven fails in some ways, and he does his very best, though, and he tries to affirm, and this is his heroism, as I said earlier. His heroism lies in his affirmation that human beings are capable of love and compassion, and beauty and hope. And that is the essence of his character. And, if that's a prophet, then so be it, But I think you're right in your question, in that should be a message we are all carrying around with us. But it seems like it has taken certain people historically to remind us of this very basic thing again and again and again. And Day-Raven does so in many ways. He comes to the realization, he was always a lover of stories, but he comes to the realization that you can't just tell people, love other people, be nice. You can't just tell them, because they will forget that in 5 seconds. But if you tell them a story that sticks with them, that can be transformative, because they have to arrive at that conclusion themselves as a result of thinking about the story. That's the power of storytelling. And so that's what he tries to do. He tries to tell people parables and stories and things in order to get them to arrive at this understanding within themselves. And yeah, he's trying to bring about reconciliation among people, the Torlanders and the Cargiles, who, the Torlanders did awful things to these people. And the fact that he's able to bring about a moment such as, when there's a crowd of people listening to him, and the old man just gets up and he goes and hugs a Torlander soldier as a moment, as a gesture of forgiveness, that suggests that he had some success in that.
Yeah, there's a very beautiful quote, I think, by Galdor in book 2, where he says the real power of Day-Raven is not the elf, it's his love for the world and everyone in it. So that I found that very beautiful. Yeah.
Galdor is a pretty wise fellow. Yeah. He says a few things that in places, I think, come close to maybe to what I myself feel about life. So that's definitely one of them. Yeah. So thank you. Matt, what do you think of Return to Edan?
Well, what do I think of Return to Edan? So, outside of anything written by Tolkien, this may be my favorite fantasy book I've ever read.
Wow.
Pretty sure I could say that.
I appreciate the Tolkien caveat, by the way. I appreciate.
Well, I mean, I may overuse that. Sometimes I say when I'm describing things that not talking about, excluding what Tolkien wrote. I don't know. He's my favorite author who wrote my favorite books.
Yep.
But outside of that, I mean, this story spoke to me and moved me in ways that really no other fantasy book has done. And again, we all bring our own experiences. We all bring our own thoughts and so some of the thoughts I may have had may not be what you were intending, but it's still,
which is great. Yeah.
So there's a particular chapter, chapter 15, Parables, Songs, and Truths.
Yes.
Now, and I know that, again, this isn't a perfect comparison. I understand that. But there are some in literature and fantasies, we see, I'm going to use the word Christ figures, messianic type figures. Sure. I think King Arthur has his own way of being that in some ways. And I think it's hard for me not to see that in Day-Raven here, especially in this chapter. And there are some differences, obviously, but there are some similarities. The second paragraph, not really much of a public reader, but he peered down the grassy hillside after thousands of gazes awaiting him. Sick in body and spirit, they had journeyed from all over Cargillion and Adanan, from villages and towns, from coastal fells to inner plains. They had arrived in expectation of healing and consolation. And so, again, this reminded me of there's a text in the Gospels where something very similar is happening, and the crowds are surrounding Jesus, and he looks at them with compassion. Yeah. And I think I see a lot of that here. And he moves on. I was going to mention the story that was already mentioned about the old man coming and embracing the soldier. That was a beautiful beautiful and moving scene. There is the parable. I say parable. I call it parable. There's the story that he tells
Parable.
here
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
About the brothers.
Yep.
And then he even gives, after it, he gives an explanation of it, which is also something Jesus did on several occasions when he would tell a parable but wouldn't tell the meaning, and then he would go back just privately with his disciples and tell the meaning. That it seems like that's similar here. Though there's another comparison that I made in my own mind. So when he describes the relationship between these two brothers and the one brother not concerned about the mother, and he talks about the meaning of that, we're all connected. We're all connected in one way or the other. We're all connected in our essence, whether people and animals and all of that. We're all connected, and so we should be able to love one another and be forgiving of one another and understanding of one another. That reminded me of what I would believe, that we are all created in the image of God.
Uh-huh.
And even if someone doesn't agree with me, or someone doesn't look like me, or someone doesn't believe all the things I believe, there is still that connection that I believe that they were created in the image of God. I was created in the image of God, and everybody is worthy of respect. Everybody is worthy of love,
Yes.
and to be shown mercy. And so that all of this just came, especially in this particular section, these few chapters where it was Raven was the prophet of Edan, and it was focused on him. And it just, there's so much here that I think is important, not only for entertainment. It's a very entertaining and very action-packed book. In fact, the action in this particular book, where you jump from POV to POV on either side, it's some of the most entertaining and best action I've ever read, battle scenes. But the important things here of loving one another and being forgiving of one another, and even if there's differences, being able to see the good in one another is just such an important thing. Again, I don't really have a question. I'm sorry, just observations that came to me as I was reading.
Oh, that's lovely.
And there's a lot, and there's a lot to chew on. I mean, even after I've read this, I find myself going back and thinking about certain scenes and events, and getting so much out of it even after I've finished it.
That's lovely, Matt. I really appreciate it. And in fact, I think that, yeah, it's clear in many ways there are some parallels between, well, you could say that Raven is a kind of Christ figure in some ways. There is he's trying to spread a similar message. And Jesus himself quoted the Hebrew scriptures and said, "I tell you, you are gods," right? And there's also the other religious traditions where he's trying to tell people you need to respect other people, we're all created in the image of God, and so yeah, that is a very important similarity. Big difference, of course, as I said earlier, Raven is not a divine figure,
Right.
He's just a mortal. He's just a person, and as I said before, like Frodo in Lord of the Rings, very similar in that respect, I think. Yeah, they're very different in many ways, but like Frodo, ultimately, he fails, right? In some ways, because he's only human.
But even in his failure, even Frodo's failure, and Raven's failure, you still see very much positive things come from that.
Sure. Yeah.
There was obviously an ending coming, and his failure seemed to be a part of bringing things around to that, I would say, positive ending in a lot of ways. Yeah. Also, you mentioned him being a very human figure. I absolutely loved the parts where he was at conflict with the elf. He wants to show mercy to someone, and the elf says, "Give him to me. Let me have him. Let me put him at rest." And it was constant battle back and forth.
Yeah.
And of course, it starts off where he has the upper hand, and then obviously he loses that upper hand. But still, watching that conflict, seeing people through the elf's perspective, in that people are, as you've said, a cancer, and people need to be, the earth needs to be cleansed of them. But Raven wanting to see the good nature of people. That was, it was very, it kept me into the story. It kept me very interested in the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, Jesus would explain the parables to his disciples, and Day Raven had Saren, and he had Edge, and he had the others who were helping him. He never would have lasted without Saren. Saren was a very heroic figure in all of this too. One of my favorite characters.
I am correct in that, Saren, right?
Yes, yeah, you got that one.
Yeah. 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3.
That is Saren, and that's the moment when she is singing. And she's basically followed Galdor and Orvandil and Gnorn and Abin. And she's like, I'm going with you. And they're like, well, Abin especially is, no, you're not. We're going somewhere very dangerous. You're a child. We cannot bring you. And she's just so stubborn, and she insists. And Abin is upset about that. And, they're making camp for the night, and he's tuning his instrument. And he sees that she's very interested in his harp, and he seems to understand. Musicians, they get each other, right? They can feel something there. And there's that whole scene where she sings, and all of her passion and the beauty of her life comes out in that voice. So that's the scene that is being portrayed there.
And I'm glad you said that. I didn't realize that. I'm glad you said that, because of all of, like I said, like the bird's eye view in the first book, there was several things in the second book. That was one of the scenes in the third book that just I fell in love with, and probably is my favorite scene. And I went back and reread that 2 or 3 times, where she's saying, and you have Edan, his attitude towards her changed, and just the beauty of that. That was a very beautiful part.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's going to sound absolutely ridiculous for me to say this, but I can't read that scene without crying, which is silly because I wrote it. But yeah, I don't know. There's something about Saren. I feel like she just sort of led me to write her character the way it came out, and I was happy with the way the role that she played, and she really stole the show in some ways, I think.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
There was another quote in book 2 that I meant to mention, but in line with the same, it was very moving. It was when Day Raven, I believe it's when he first met Galdor. I believe it's when he first met. He says something strange about the old man struck Day Raven. He could not put words to it. The wizard seemed of the earth and yet unbound, as if he came from nowhere in particular and could call anywhere home. Just those passages like that, those quotes like that. Just every once in a while, I would share them on Twitter or just write them down in my notebook on my phone, just so I could keep them and remember them.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Wonderful questions. And finally, Vaughn, Return to Edan. Your thoughts or questions?
First of all, it's my favorite of the 3, most quoted, most flat.
Yeah.
But I guess I would make an observation in regard to what was said. The whole period of no POV from Day Raven for quite a chunk of the beginning. What is about 30-35% of the
about a third. About a third.
Yeah. We don't get his perspective. We get everybody else hearing things from him or seeing him or experiencing him. And I thought that was brilliantly done. And as a fellow writer, I will say it's risky. I mean, it's one of those things that when you read all the standard advice is get your reader back with your protagonist right away. And so there was that. Well done, and worth the risk. It was beautifully portrayed. And even when we first get Day Raven's perspective, that you beautifully illustrate his not knowing himself. He calls himself the Prophet of Edan. He doesn't even use his own name, and it's third person, but it feels very first person. And the struggle, like Matt was talking about, between the elf and his human self, or his, is a beautifully, it moves the story. It's very immersive, and I just wanted to add that. But I guess what I would ask you about is there is significant loss. We're talking spoilers here, right?
Spoilers, yeah.
So there's significant loss with this book. And that's sort of risky too. I mean, it's not very Tolkien-esque, and the whole fellowship survives, basically the Lord of the Rings. So did you have in mind that you were going to portray those losses, or did they evolve as you wrote?
All right, so the idea of loss, and there are some very heavy losses in A Return to Edan, particularly, where some major characters are no longer with us, and particularly at the end. Another, I think, risk that I took in this book was it doesn't end very conventionally. I think the expected climax would be Torhelm. And there is a kind of climax there, but then there's this sort of, resolution seems to be, but nope, not really. And, the characters reunite. Sequara shows up. It was important to me to give Dayraven and Sequara at least one more time to get together. But then the action goes back up again with what happens in the Mark as the elf Dwola army, if you will, the elf zombies who used to be the Elarchai, are heading that way. And you have all these individual tragedies wrapped up in that, including Munzil and the various Torlanders who are affected. And Dayraven realizes, wait, what have I done here? I need to fix this. And his ultimate sacrifice. And this is another way, Matt, in which I think, you could say there's a Christ-like element to Dayraven, is his sacrifice. But it's a very human sacrifice too, I think. This is a moment when I really tried to bring everything together. There are several ways in which I tried to bring book 3 and remind you of many things, and hopefully even change the way you read some things in book 1 and 2. For example, the ghost raven showing up early on. We don't know what that really is until the very end of Return to Edan, and we realize, oh, that was Dayraven himself, putting himself on this path from the realm of origins, from this timeless place, realizing I need to do this to make this happen, right? I need to do this. And that's a conscious decision of sacrifice in that moment, realizing, hey, what if I never did do that? Then I could be home with Ebba and Dad and Imhar, and everything would be fine. But he chooses to give up everything in that moment. So he sends the raven back in time to basically draw him into the forest for that encounter. He sends the raven. It would have been much easier for him to end things on that mountain, the Wyrmberg, in book 2, just before encountering Gorsarhad, the dragon. He was hanging, by his hand on the cliff face. Would have been much easier for him. He would have been spared a lot of pain if things had ended there. But no, he sent the raven back to make sure he made it. So a lot of things I'm trying to tie back together. I even reintroduced characters like Bagsack, right? And Ludicon from the Mercenary Company. And I'm trying to bring everything back together. And a lot of that is, I knew this had to end in the Mark, where Dayraven came from. This is another aspect of the return. Now, he very literally returns to Edan in the sense that he gives up his life, his soul, in that moment of sacrifice. But he also goes back to where it all started, to the Mark, and meets Ebba. Ebba has another moment in there which was important to me, to give her that moment, and he realizes how much he has changed when he comes back to the Mark, and how much he loves this place. And the fact is that even though he's in exile, even though the very people that were very dear to him, some of them accuse him of being a traitor, such as Ebba's father, but there's still that affection and that very human attachment to this place that he loves. So he gives up his life. There are other I felt very noble sacrifices in that moment of saving the Mark. There's Elfwe, who's the Earl from Elland, who dives right in there with his soldiers in order to buy Dare even a little more time. And of course, they all are chopped to pieces by the zombies. The
Who was expecting zombies?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The mercenary company, what's left of them under Ludicon, they all die except for one, who's a new guy actually. There has to be a witness, to go back and tell people. So yeah, there's a lot of loss at the end, and of course, it was very hard for me to write the Sequara parts at the end. Very hard for me to write that, and I tried to bring a little light, a little hope, a little beauty into it by having the reunion with Saren and Imhar, which was all the way back to the first book, the promise of finding Imhar's sister. And of course, Saren is not Imhar's sister, but she's his niece.
Yeah, beautiful moment.
I hope so. I hope so. I hope there is some consolation in those scenes as well, and the promise that from these sacrifices will come a better world, because you have a new king in Torland who is a much better human being. You have what will become a new supreme priest of the Way, who is that little tiny side character that Dayraven and Imhar met in the first book. The priest that they met at the inn, who turned out to be a really nice guy, right? He's a real deal. He's, I'm sure, like Matt, a very love-based leader of his flock. He takes care of his people. He spreads a message of love, and that's the kind of person I want to be in charge of an important institution, right? Somebody who's a person of the people, a person who is genuine, who is an example of love. So I hope that there's some, sense of hope at the end of this, in spite of all the loss, because I do think this is something I talked about with my agent. In order for an ending to feel compelling, it can't just be everything's great now. There has to be some kind of loss, some kind of sacrifice in order for that to feel compelling, because that is the nature of life. Life is love and grief are very much wrapped together in this existence. And I think we have to learn to accept that, and to embrace it even, and to, like Dayraven, embrace the people you love, knowing full well that there will be grief when you part. So, yeah.
And you forgot one of the major elements of hope there is Sequara is literally a vessel for hope.
Yeah, that's right.
So
yeah, she has a baby inside her. Yeah. So yes, and there will be a standalone sequel set 15 years later. So I'm sure you can imagine. You could probably imagine a few of the characters who might appear in While Darkness Gathers. Yeah. So
can't wait.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I almost, when I read the ending, I almost, having a personal conflict with it, I thought the death of Dayraven almost seemed needless. Just when I first read it, and I thought, well, his hometown had rejected him. They didn't want him there. They said, get out of here. You're a traitor. So he leaves, and then they had already made the agreement with the elf that they were going to just go away. But he loved his hometown. He loved his people. Even though that love wasn't returned, he still loved them enough that's who he died for. Yep. And I know there's more to it than just that, but just specifically that stood out to me after I thought about it more.
Yes. And he knew his people. And I think there was a part of him that knew all along that they were going to defend their homes, because that's who they are. There's a deep, deep honor code among the people of the Mark, as there are. I'm basing them on Old English and culture and so forth. So loyalty to one's kin, loyalty to one's place, to one's tribe, is paramount. And for them to leave their home, and allow a foreign army to invade it is unthinkable. And furthermore, they worship courage. Courage is what, you know, they try to embody, and especially courage in the face of certain doom, which it certainly is, you know, whether or not they're elf zombies or just humans coming at them, and they don't really know what to believe, but they see humans and they're vastly outnumbered. They have no chance against this invading army. And yet they insist we must defend our home because that's who they are. And Dayraven knew that, and he was afraid of that. And he dies in order to save them, in knowing all of that. And yeah, that was his a particular moment that hopefully I think cemented why he would be willing to do that is when he meets Ebba. I feel like that's a crucial scene when he sees Ebba with her baby, and she embodies so much of what he loved. He still loves her, by the way, as well. There's a part of him that always will, you know, even though Dayraven and Sequara are clearly in the Dayraven of the present is very much in love with Sequara. You can't just turn off who you were, you know, in the past so easily either. So, you know, I mean, he makes that decision, I think, perhaps not even acknowledging it to himself, the moment that he sees Ebba, and says, I won't give up on you, you know? So yeah. Any final thoughts before we sign off? You guys have been so generous with your time, and I so appreciate everything. Any final thoughts from any of you three? And it appears that I have lost internet. Let me. And so, yeah, that I think more or less sums up my thoughts there. We had a brief internet interruption. So, but I think I had said pretty much what I wanted to say about that. So any final thoughts then from any of you? You've been so generous with your time, and I appreciate it so deeply. But any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with?
So something that I thought about it as I was reading, but especially as we've been sitting here talking, it's kind of not really a concluding thought or anything like that, but something that I noticed throughout the three books. So in the first book, in the Way of Edan, you had the, for lack of a better word, the possession of the creatures.
Yes.
Against their will. And of course you felt for them, especially when you realized that they knew what was going on and they didn't want it. They wanted to be with their family or whatever it was, and was against their will. And so you see that possession. And in book 2, you see the possession of the dragons, which is the same thing, a little bit different. And you did feel for the dragons. And in book 3, you see the possession of people. And I guess when the Okari were possessed there at the end, it just really stood out to me that this may be a pattern that we see kind of driving our emotions, seeing, well, this is against their will. This is something that they don't want to happen, especially with that particular relationship. I forgot the name of the man. But anyway, the man and the woman, Ilkari.
Munzil.
And you see the relationship. Yeah. Yes. You see that relationship progressing and the heartbreak that causes. And just taking away their free will, taking away their ability to choose. And that just stood out to me as I thought about the progression through the 3 books.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a great pickup, Matt. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That is a question we haven't talked about at all, and I haven't talked about much in the course of all these conversations, but the idea of free will and how much of it do we have, if any. So yeah. And the narrowing of choices and one's ability to make choices in situations like that, where Munzil makes a decision to try to save the humanity that he can. He's the poor guy. He lost his tribe, the Grey Wolves. He lost in this situation his new family, his new tribe, this reassertion of his own identity through bringing together the folk of the tribes. And yeah, things end very tragically for the Ilarkai. And I don't think of them as villains in this at all. You know, in some respects, their culture is actually better. You know, they're less patriarchal, for example, than the Torlanders and others. So, but yeah, and they have some genuine grievances as well. But yeah, they made a very tragic end, and I felt pretty bad for Munzel in that moment. But he, in his mind at least, is able to take back Skuld's body in that moment, and that moment of his sacrifice. He also makes a sacrifice there, doesn't he? But yeah, so. But thank you, and I want to thank all three of you once again. This has been a delight for me. I have enjoyed this so much. It's a privilege to be able to have people read your story at all, but also to be able to discuss it with them with such supportive and kind and lovely people as you three are. I appreciate this very much. So thank you, all three of you.
The pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. And
we enjoyed it.
Thank you to you, my viewers, as well. And I will be doing a couple more of these discussions. And probably releasing one a month or so. But thank you so much for watching, and until next time.